Welcome to The Explainer. I am so thrilled to have you here today. Okay, let's just dive straight into this, because today we're unpacking a fascinating, highly complex, and frankly, pretty shocking analysis based on our source material regarding the dark reality of global narco terrorism. I mean, think about it. Governments worldwide spend hundreds of billions of dollars. They launch special task forces, they declare these endless wars on drugs, and yet, according to the analysis we're exploring today, year after year, the global drug trade only seems to grow more powerful and more protected. So why is that? Well, today we are going to uncover the hidden mechanisms of a system that goes way, way beyond what you see on the evening news. So who really controls the global drug trade? When you hear the words drug trafficking, what instantly comes to mind? Usually, pop culture completely conditions us to picture these ruthless cartels hiding out in jungles or street-level gangs, maybe dramatic shootouts in remote territories. But our source material, it completely flips that narrative on its head. There is this stark contrast between perception and reality here. On one side, we have that pop culture narrative we just talked about, the cartels, the street gangs, but on the other side, we have the source's core claim that the global drug trade is actually orchestrated from the top down. The analysis argues that the true masters of this trade are actually elite institutions, international banks, and global intelligence agencies, and they're operating right out of sophisticated boardrooms. It's an incredibly provocative claim, no doubt, and our goal today is to impartially map out exactly how the source builds this argument.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to redefine narco terrorism, break down its 4 operational pillars, trace its historical roots, examine the role of modern agencies and banks, and finally, look at the immediate threat this poses to India.
All right, Section 1, redefining narco terrorism, moving beyond street-level crime. Now, the term narco terrorism originally popped up way back in the 1980s in Peru, mostly to describe violent rebel groups that were using drug money, but our source expands this significantly. The analysis notes that narco-terrorism today is the use of illegal drug cultivation, trafficking, and laundering not just by rogue criminals, but by legitimate states, governments, and intelligence agencies to covertly advance their political, religious, or ideological objectives. It's literally about leveraging illegal funds for massive geopolitical power.
Section 2, the 4 pillars of operation, the mechanics of the global trade.
According to the source, this whole system rests on 4 main pillars. First up, financing. Drug money directly funds massive geopolitical movements and militant groups. The source cites the historical funding of the Mujahideen and the Taliban, FARC in Colombia, the LTTE, and Hezbollah as prime examples of this. Second, protection economies. In weak or fractured states, like parts of modern Myanmar, for instance, armed forces provide physical protection to drug processing facilities in exchange for some pretty hefty taxes. Third, and this is perhaps the most heavily emphasized in the analysis, covert operations by legitimate governments. Because, intelligence agencies have limited, heavily audited budgets, the source claims they actually turn to the drug trade to generate untraceable black money for secret operations. And finally, the 4th pillar, weaponized destabilization. This is the act of deliberately pushing drugs across borders just to addict an enemy population and weaken them from the inside out.
Let's move to Section 3, historical and colonial roots, the empire built on opium. The source makes a fascinating point here, that narco-terrorism wasn't just invented yesterday. It's actually a deeply entrenched colonial legacy. It starts way back in the 1800s with the British Empire in China. Fast forward to the 1960s, and the analysis points to alleged CIA drug transport operations in Laos during the Vietnam War era, utilizing tribal alliances. Then, by 1979, the chronological journey shifts to the Afghan War, where the source claims Pakistan's ISI and Western intelligence actually catalyzed mass opium production to fund the war against the Soviets. And finally, we reach 2021, when a sudden Taliban opium ban completely shook up the global supply. Okay, this part is wild. The source makes a really profound claim here, that the original blueprint for weaponized destabilization was actually drafted by the British East India Company. Facing a massive trade deficit with China because they were buying up all this silk, tea, and ceramics, Britain desperately needed a way to get their silver and gold back. So they essentially acted as a state-sponsored drug cartel. They cultivated opium in the Bengal presidency, smuggled it into China, and deliberately addicted the Chinese population. And when China tried to ban it, Britain literally went to war, the Opium Wars. The source asserts that the institutional frameworks, the trafficking routes, and the systemic corruption born in this era
basically laid the foundation for today's entire global drug trade.
Which brings us to Section 4, Intelligence Agencies and Banks, the modern power players. After World War II, the legacy of those colonial narco networks was allegedly inherited by modern intelligence agencies. The source impartially levels from extremely heavy claims here. It asserts the CIA took over networks in Latin America and Southeast Asia, using covert transport planes and shell companies to move drugs and launder money through places like Panama, all to fund unauthorized operations. Similarly, it claims Pakistan's ISI relies heavily on the heroin trade out of Afghanistan to fund its military, utilizing that weaponized border destabilization tactic against India. $6 trillion. Let that number just sink in for a second. To put that staggering figure into perspective, the source points out that this is almost double the entire GDP of India. And this is the estimated amount of illicit drug money that is washed through the international banking system every single year.
Now, you might be wondering, how do you even process that much money? Well, the source claims that international banking systems are utterly complicit. For example, the analysis mentions a case where a major global bank, HSBC, was fined $1.9 billion for laundering hundreds of billions in drug money. But as the source rightly points out, no executives went to jail. The fine was basically just treated as the cost of doing business. Meanwhile, the source highlights a much darker reality. Investigative journalists who actually try to expose this nexus between agencies and banks, reporters like Gary Webb and Michael Hastings in the US, they frequently meet highly suspicious, fatal ends.
And this brings us to a really fascinating economic ripple effect. The source observes that when the Taliban instituted an opium ban in Afghanistan around 2021, global heroin production absolutely plummeted, dropping by 80 to 90%. And who did this hurt the most? Well, according to the analysis, it severely triggered an economic crisis in Pakistan. The source claims that the Pakistani military apparatus is so heavily reliant on this untraceable drug money to sustain itself that the analysis refers to the country's economic reality in terms almost akin to a heroin state.
Section 5. The threat to India. Spillover at the borders.
So, what does this all mean for us? That is the absolutely critical question here. How does a massive global system involving the CIA, historic British trade routes, and international banks actually end up affecting everyday lives in India? Well, because the Afghan supply dried up, the historical Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia basically reactivated, leading to a direct spillover into India's border states. The source notes that by taking advantage of civil unrest, we're now seeing open-air opium cultivation happening right in Manipur. On top of that, the incredibly porous border with Myanmar is being used to smuggle both drugs and weapons at just an alarming rate. And we also see this weaponized destabilization tactic heavily deployed in Punjab, creating these deliberate generational addiction crises specifically designed to weaken the state from within. But wait, it gets more complex. It's not just plant-based drugs anymore. The source brings up a really critical covert threat to India's broader economy. Look, India is known as the pharmacy of the world, right? We are a superpower in generic medicine. But this massive, incredibly vital sector is increasingly being targeted and infiltrated by bad actors for the production of synthetic opioids and precursor chemicals. And on top of this economic threat, there is a severe public health crisis. The source points out a truly tragic correlation. As drug use and syringe sharing spike in border regions like Manipur and Punjab, there was a subsequent alarming rise in HIV and AIDS rates in those exact same areas.
And all of this brings us to the ultimate plea from our source material, a phrase you've probably heard a million times: say no to drugs. But in the context of literally everything we've just learned, the source frames this not merely as a piece of personal health advice, but as a critical act of national defense. When you understand that this money is actively funding destabilization, violence, and institutional corruption, rejecting it completely shifts. It goes from a personal choice to a powerful, tangible way to fight back against a systemic global machine.
I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to chew on today. Based on the claims from our analysis, if the very intelligence agencies and financial institutions meant to protect the world are actually funded by and profiting from this perpetual crisis, what is the true cost of global security? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those tough questions, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next one.